to our podcast. I am Kelly Birmingham. This is a 25-year look back across the spectrum. Now it's 27 years since that I have been working in the field, working with children and adults with autism and developmental disabilities. And with me is always my partner in crime, Jen, mom to Dylan and Ethan. Hi, Jen.
Hey, Kelly.
So we're back at it today, podcasting. And it is funny, 27 years, because we started this podcast 2 years ago. And we have hours and hours of content and thousands of downloads. So I'm super excited. I'm going to give a shout out to SitePro, CEU company that is sponsoring us. I do courses with them. They also, if people are listening to this podcast, can get free CEUs by listening to it through SitePro. So we're glad to have SitePro on board with us. So, Jen, we're going to talk today. I often reference this. There was an article that came out in the Behavior Analysis and Practice Journal. It was in 2018 by Dr. Taylor LeBlanc and Nosek, and it was basically the compassionate care. It talked about compassionate care as BCBAs, and that's a big topic of mine, right? Like our last podcast, what do caregivers want out of their BCBA? And what I'm always drawn from this article is that they basically surveyed caregivers and family members and said, how do you feel about your BCBA? And scored them. And out of this article, they basically shared that it's a great article. I'll list it in the session notes, but that a lot of family members felt that their BCBA wasn't compassionate enough. They weren't empathetic enough, that they often rushed to solve problems rather than be in the moment with the parent. And I'm guilty of this. And I actually can vividly remember conversations with you when Dylan was like 4, 5, 6 years old. And you were bringing to me problems that you had. And I was so busy trying to fix them without listening to what you had to say. And so, let's start there. Like, how tell other BCBAs or share a little bit for family members that, what do you want from your BCBA when you're sharing like really private personal information about the stress you're experiencing raising a child on the spectrum?
Yeah, well, I think even at a young age and even, as they grow up into adults, it evolves, but I think it is hard. I understand the fixing part, because I think in my mind, like as it's happening to you, I am also trying to fix the problem and figure out like what's happening and why. But I think it's especially when they're young, and Dylan was super aggressive when he was young and just tantrums and it was like pretty wild. And I know like just like for myself, like when it would just start and like, it's like your whole body would my whole body would tense up, and I would it's almost like kind of like an anxiety attack, but you're trying not to show it. Like you're trying not to react or get upset and like just like deal with the moment. But I think you try to internalize, and I get, especially if you have someone in the house trying to help you through whatever situation is going, and like you said, they're trying to fix it. But there's a lot of weird things. Like there's also like guilt, or the feeling of what am I doing wrong? Like feeling like, am I setting off a behavior? Am I reacting right? Should I be reacting differently? What do I do? And there's times that you even just want to run and hide, but you can't, because either he could hurt himself, he'll probably start destroying things. He was never a eloper, but I'm sure that is a big fear for a lot of people. So yeah, I think you're just like, I have no idea what's happening and why. And I think in your head, like especially if someone's there like you're just thinking, help me. You know, does
Yeah.
that make sense?
And I did this badly. And I'm watching younger. When I say younger, I mean younger in their experience, not age, but younger BCBAs make the same mistakes.
Mm,
And it's sort of like, like when you're a parent and you tell your kids not to do something because you went through
yeah,
it, but they're going to do it anyway, right?
yeah.
But I have vivid memories. When I became a BCBA, it was in 2003.
Mhm,
I'm the 1,368th in the world, right? There's a
mhm.
lot of men
Yeah.
and in the field. It's changed. It's significantly higher ratios to women now because a lot of BCBAs are working with folks with autism, particularly younger children, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Yep.
it was a lot of men in the field. And so as a woman, like I've had men that I supervise make more money than me. Right.
Mhm.
I've had men who I supervise do things that they shouldn't have done and do a lot
Yeah.
of like that was the culture. Um,
Yeah.
some of my bosses, probably did some things that I look back and say they could never get away with now. So as a woman in the field, I was constantly trying to prove myself, right? Prove
Mhm.
my worthy. And so I also in doing that well, you knew me in 2004.
Yeah, I was
I
gonna
like
say, yeah, I mean, that
I
you
had
were the first person that they sent me to.
yeah, I mean I'd
Dylan.
worked in the field for, since 1995, but the BCBA didn't come around until 1999,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
certification, and really kind of took off in 2000, 2001. And that's when I started doing my coursework and everything. But I spent so much time trying to prove myself. And you work so hard to take the test. Like the test itself is like this beast that everyone
Yeah.
takes. So now here I am, but they don't. And people who listen to us have heard me say this. There's no training on family systems, no training on like motivational interviewing and dynamics. And I can remember blaming parents for their behavior.
Mhm.
And I can remember saying, like, well, if you followed my behavior plan, your child might act better kind of attitude. And I see BCBAs doing that now. I might have even done it to you.
I don't know, I don't think, I mean, other people blame me,
Right,
for
right.
Dylan's behavior, but, and actually, to your point on one thing, I think a big eye opener for me with Dylan in general, because I'm an only child, and my parents had me really young, wasn't really around like a ton of kids. Like I was, going to concerts with them. I was like the third person with them. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to like babies or like kids. And like all this stuff going on with Dylan, like honestly, it took me a couple of years and he didn't even get diagnosed till 4.5.
Right.
But it wasn't until I had Ethan, and they're 23 months apart. And then I just saw like right away a difference just in every aspect of Ethan's like development, that it kind of made more sense. But then it made me feel like less, so I guess guilty or not blaming myself, because I'm like, okay, if I was just a shitty mom and like totally clueless, like why is Ethan doing everything like on track, if not faster, and not having these behaviors or these same issues? Um,
Yeah.
so I'm probably actually fortunate, and the fact that like when I got pregnant with Ethan, like, I didn't even know Dylan was autistic yet. And yet, like as things were developing and the first couple of years of Ethan's life, and when Dylan was, at you know, for let's say even that 4 to 6 range when we met you, and that's when we started all the therapies, like, it's just, there was so much happening, but I could compare. Does that make sense?
It does. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But I think so this article, I reference it so much. Anyone who talks to me, I talk
Mhm.
about it ad nauseum. But basically the article talked about things that we're not trained as BCBAs, sort of this
Mhm.
concept of like motivational interviewing or like being present. And so I'm actually quoting something from this article, but it basically talked about engaging the parent in conversation and actively listening to their concerns without trying to solve anything at first, but
Mhm.
just listening. So, for example, about, and you know this all too well, children's sleep being disrupted, families
Mhm.
being exhausted and fatigued the next day for not sleeping and having to get up and go to work. And then, since we as BCBAs are in the home so much, just thinking about that, right? And then it talks about like helping, listening to the families, and then develop an intervention that meets them where they're at. And there's this movement in our field that talks about like compassionate care. A whole bunch of us were doing this anyway, right? But
Mhm.
I'm excited that this movement is happening.
Yeah.
But the one that comes to mind the most that to this day, our field is not done well enough, and that it's the thing that keeps me up at night. Particularly now, I've shifted my career a little bit, and I've
Mhm.
put myself in the position of working specifically with a very severely and profoundly adolescents and adults impacted with autism. And there's no question the stress involved with the unknown medical answers,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, for
I don't know
sure.
if you want to share a little bit about, what you've gone through recently, but I can think of at least 20 kids I know right now that their behavior can only be explained, kids, they're
Mhm.
grown adults,
Yeah.
by some kind of internal discomfort, some physical state,
Mhm.
because there's nothing else we can figure out is causing them to injure themselves severely,
Mhm.
go after other people. And you
Mhm.
experience that.
Yeah, I mean, Dylan's had medical issues from the get-go,
Yep.
literally since, you know, since he was born. And then, there were always kind of stomach issues. A lot of times we didn't,
Yep.
I mean, it literally has taken forever to figure things out, or thinking it's one thing. And then, I mean, I remember when we first met you, because he didn't sleep and he would wake up. When he did finally sleep, he would wake up screaming,
Yep. I remember.
and we thought maybe he was having night terrors or something. And then it was like, okay, we think he has acid reflux and like all this stuff, and just not knowing. And he couldn't sleep, he couldn't be comfortable, he couldn't tell us what was wrong. And he never slept, and like in turn I never slept, and yet I work full time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like there's almost like years that I was walking around like a zombie,
Yep.
just trying to make it through. But and then you'd think you'd figure certain things out, or Dylan has had every freaking test under the sun, that,
Yep.
over the years. And then there was times when he got really ill. He was in the hospital for a while. They couldn't figure it out. They thought it was either just like either a bacterial or viral
Yep.
infection. And now looking back, because he got sick again, um, earlier in the year, and lost a bunch of weight and was getting very, very ill, and ended up in the hospital. And we ended up doing tons of testing. And he's finally has a diagnosis of Crohn's disease now. And he had a bunch of ulcers. And his small intestine was inflamed. So we've been doing like a lot of medical treatment now. And it was weird because, like, for example, he was put on like Prevacid forever, and we were
Yep.
told it was acid reflux. But then when we took him off the Prevacid and started other stuff, like, it's and I'm never gonna be like, oh well, like, we had a whole team. Like, we've been, trying to do stuff and figure tons of doctors and teams and therapists and service providers forever, right? And now there was a part of guilt, like when I did get
Yep.
diagnosed with this on my end.
Which just happened like a month ago.
Yeah, it
A month
just
ago.
happened.
Mhm.
Yeah, and but also relief, and just for him, like, knowing that so far it seems like it is helping him, and just knowing what, you know, what the problem was. I mean, it was not pretty. It was, everything we went through with the testing was not fun. But he's going with it. That's the one thing I know about Dylan too, which I always find interesting, and maybe think about this as parents or as service providers. When Dylan is really sick, he actually goes with the flow, like at the hospital, with the testing. I mean, he's getting IV infusions,
I know. Who would have
and
thought?
every couple of weeks, and it's when we go in, it's a 4-hour process,
Yep.
and he sits there and lets them, do it,
I mean,
and
it used to take 4 of us to hold him down.
yeah,
It's like
I
this.
mean,
Yep.
and now he's letting them just take blood and do all this stuff to him, but I think he's aware now, and he's at a point in his life because of all the good services he's had, and intervention, and all these services. So the combo: behavior, OT, speech, like, you name it, the kids had it. And it's helped him evolve, and I think have an understanding of, like, this is actually going to help me. But yeah, I mean,
So we know, right? So like, first of all, parenting stress significantly higher families raising children with autism, right?
mhm,
The you use words like guilt, right?
mhm,
Guilt, the what am I doing wrong? And this the medical rule out part of it. So when I'm looking at this article, it basically says here's the things that caregivers had to say about BCBA's, that we focus too much on the child's challenging behavior and their deficits, right? They were too busy to talk about my program than listen to my concerns. Like I'm reading it from the article. That they're not, they're using technical language and not changing programs that will meet my needs, right?
mhm,
And so I think about this all the time. We work with families, we work with children, and when we can't figure out what the challenging behaviors function is, we are then stuck. We get stuck as behavior analysts. Families, you're stressed, you're tired, you're guilty. So then we rely on the medical field, right? And
mhm.
I have to say, you've been lucky. You find the best medical
Yeah,
people that
yeah,
I think,
I have been very lucky.
and I don't know if luck's the right word because I know they're out there, but you've had Dr. Donnelly, Dylan's
Mhm,
pediatrician, Dr. Mike, his whole life was
mhm.
fantastic. This
Well,
particular doctor figuring out the Crohn's disease, I mean,
mhm.
that's unbelievable.
And I think that was honestly, that was the GI, and
Yeah.
she's been, like, super on top of it. Um, and, we had a big insurance change a couple of years ago, and I wasn't thrilled about it, but I gotta say, the care that he has gotten, at the new, the stuff he's with, even at the hospital, it was like, even during COVID, like, they were very accommodating to both him and me. And they got it and listened. Like, I mean, I wasn't even supposed to, be in some of the
Mhm.
stuff that I was in, or staying overnight in the hospital and stuff. But I was like, he's, for him and you guys and everybody involved, like, you, it's best if you have me here and I can tell you certain things and help him, and
Yeah.
and so that's was really helpful. But yeah, it's super stressful. It still is, it's, and it, I still constantly question myself. And I think one thing that I notice, and I think we're all like this, even if you're, the ABA service provider, the BCBA or the parent or something. The one thing I always thought was interesting with Dylan is when he did have like an ultra meltdown, which would be really long. It could be 45 minutes to an hour. And then he would just do this, like, start crying himself and then be like all done and like almost like, like he's the victim. You know what I mean?
Yep,
But
yep.
what was weird was he afterwards, when he calmed himself down, he was like completely over it and almost like it didn't even happen and would just move on. But for me, or whoever else was, in the situation, just like emotionally and my body and just like mentally, like it sometimes could take me like days to get
Yes.
past it.
Yep. And so I think that as I'm thinking through this whole thing, like they don't train you that in your as a BCBA,
Mhm,
right? So we've got families that have guilt and stress and anger, right?
mhm.
And then BCBAs that have this technical skill that's great, but are just trying to fix. And so merging these and as BCBAs, just stopping and listening to the parent, and sometimes saying like, that must be hard to have not slept. And
Mhm.
that must be worrisome to not know if there's something medically wrong with your child. And so as as BCBAs, just stopping and listening and adjusting and maybe not running all the programs that day because everyone's
Oh
tired,
yeah.
right? And taking a break, but also as behavior analysts, looking at the data because sometimes we're doing a little more harm than good if we're trying strategies that aren't addressing the function. And for like Dylan, he didn't feel well. I mean, if you think about the cycle, he'd hit himself, he'd
Mhm,
really hard, he'd hit you, he's
mhm,
hit me,
mhm,
screaming, crying, then remorseful and sad,
mhm.
and all probably because he didn't feel freaking good. Right?
Yeah,
And hence
or
the
breaking stuff, like, it was always like some sort of reaction, to, yeah, I definitely feel like, and also, a huge part of it, of the problem with that, if the medical, if you're not feeling well, and if you're, if you have some speech, impairment or issues
Mhm.
or delay, that just combines it and escalates the behavior. Because think about it, if you don't feel good and you can't, you know verbally express what's happening, um like that just makes it 100 times worse for that person too.
Yep.
And not only that person, like, I think a lot of the guilt too is like, as a parent, is also in the stress level. And luckily he's like end up being the greatest person ever. But like, it's not just me, it's like especially my other son, and had to grow up, and that even though he was always seemed with it and on top of it and kind of just rolling with it, like, you've been there, he's told you, like,
Yep.
I mean, this was a long time ago, but I remember him telling you, like, I think Dylan's gonna like kill my mom someday, and
I do
just the
remember
level
that.
of stress that everybody else around,
Yep.
like, it's, and keep that in mind too, that like all of this affects the whole family, and you got to listen to like everybody that is intimately involved in that current situation, right?
Yep. We have to actively listen as BCBAs and take some moment to be in, the opportunity to be in the moment with the parent, put yourself in their shoes, right? And then lastly, I'm going to say, like, I'm basically going to say active listen, put yourself in their shoes, and you've got to rule out the medical. You just got to.
For sure.
Yep. Well, the great news as we close out today's podcast is Dylan is feeling so much better.
Yeah, he just walked in earlier and showed off his big Homer belly to Kelly again.
Yep. He's put his
Yep.
weight back on. He's
Fattening up.
fattening up. He's looking good.
Yeah.
So after, you know, and kudos to you. It was scary to have Dylan try to take the stuff for the colonoscopy. It was scary to think of him going in for all of that.
Yeah.
And I
Talk
mean,
about anxiety.
oh, Jesus. And you
Yeah.
did it, and it paid
Mhm.
off.
Yep.
Oh, we're so happy. All right. Thanks, Jen. Well, we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Kelly.
Bye.
Bye.